History classes love to focus on the big names: Waterloo, Gettysburg, D-Day, battles so famous they've become shorthand for war itself. But what about the clashes that slipped through the cracks, the fights that history textbooks glossed over, even though they reshaped borders, toppled empires, and altered the course of civilizations? Picture this: a battle so pivotal it decided the fate of an entire continent, or a desperate last stand that inspired legends for centuries, yet you've probably never heard of it. That's the untold story of warfare, and today we're diving deep into 30 of these forgotten clashes. Think about the last time you sat in a history class. Chances are you spent hours memorizing dates and generals from the same handful of wars, while countless other battles just as dramatic, just as consequential, were left out entirely. Why? Maybe they didn't fit the narrative. Maybe they happened in places that didn't make the cut in Western-centric curriculums. Or maybe they were so brutal, so strange, that historians simply didn't know how to explain them. But these battles matter. They're the hidden hinges of history, the moments where everything could have gone differently if only someone had remembered to tell the tale. So consider this your invitation to a side of history you've never seen before. We're talking about battles where the underdogs defied impossible odds, where bizarre tactics turned the tide, and where the fallout echoed for centuries. Ever heard of the time a tiny island held off a superpower with nothing but ingenuity? Or the battle that was decided by a sudden solar eclipse? These aren't fairy tales, they're real events buried under layers of dust and time. And by the end of this journey, you'll wonder how they ever stayed hidden. Ready to uncover what your history teacher missed? Let's begin. Long before the age of tanks and drones, warfare was a brutal chess match of wits and willpower, and no one played it better than Pharaoh Thutmose III. Picture this: the year is roughly 1458 before the Common Era, and the sun beats down on the plains of Megiddo, a strategic choke point in what's now modern-day Israel. Thutmose, only 25 years old but already a seasoned commander, faces a rebellion. A coalition of Canaanite city-states, tired of Egyptian rule, has united under the king of Kadesh. Their forces outnumber his. Their position on the high ground seems unshakable. Every textbook would tell you this fight should have been a bloody stalemate, but Thutmose didn't read those textbooks. Instead, he did something no one saw coming. While his enemies guarded the obvious mountain passes, Thutmose led his entire army, chariots, infantry, and all through a narrow, near-impassable gorge called the Aruna Road. Historians still debate how he pulled it off. The path was so tight, his troops had to march single file, vulnerable to ambush at any moment. But that was the genius of it. The Canaanites never imagined he'd be reckless enough to try. When his army spilled onto the plains behind enemy lines at dawn, the coalition forces were still camped miles away, guarding the wrong routes. Panic set in. The Canaanites scrambled to form battle lines, but it was too late. Thutmose's chariots carved through them like a sickle through wheat. The aftermath was even more staggering. Instead of pressing his advantage to slaughter fleeing troops, standard practice at the time, Thutmose ordered his men to stop and loot the enemy camp. That decision might sound strange, but it was pure psychological warfare. By letting the survivors escape, he ensured they'd spread tales of his invincibility. City after city surrendered without a fight. Megiddo itself held out for 7 months under siege, but when it fell, Egypt's grip on the Near East tightened for centuries. This wasn't just a battle, it was the birth of an empire, and the craziest part, we know all this because Thutmose's scribes carved the entire campaign, blow by blow, into the walls of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, making Megiddo one of history's first fully documented battles. But here's what they don't teach you. Thutmose's real weapon wasn't his army, it was his mind. While other kings led from the rear, he rode at the front, sharing every risk. He didn't just win battles, he rewrote the rules. After Megiddo, he launched 17 more campaigns in 20 years, not just conquering lands but integrating them. He built roads, appointed local governors, and even took the sons of defeated rulers back to Egypt as hostages, but then educated them in his court, turning enemies into allies. That's why his empire didn't crumble like others. He understood something timeless. True victory isn't just about crushing your enemy. It's about making sure they never want to fight you again. And that lesson, buried under 3.5 millennia of dust, still echoes in the strategies of generals today. The dense woods of Germania in the year 9 of the Common Era were no place for arrogance, but Rome hadn't gotten the memo. Fresh off centuries of conquest, the empire's legions were the uncontested masters of the Mediterranean world. So when Emperor Augustus sent Publius Quinctilius Varus, a trusted politician with more ambition than military sense, to govern the wild frontier of Germania, it seemed like just another routine assignment. Subdue the locals, collect taxes, and plant the eagle standard a little farther north. What could go wrong? As it turns out, everything. Because lurking in the shadows of the Teutoburg Forest was a man who knew Rome's playbook better than Rome itself. Arminius, a Germanic prince raised as a hostage in Rome, fluent in Latin and trained in its tactics. He'd been waiting for this moment. Varus marched 3 legions, 17,000 men, plus thousands of support staff, deep into the forest, lulled into complacency by Arminius's apparent loyalty. The Germanic prince had even provided intelligence about a minor rebellion, urging Varus to take a detour through unfamiliar terrain to crush it, but the rebellion was fiction. The narrow, muddy paths Arminius led them down were a death trap. Then the skies opened. A torrential downpour turned the forest floor into a bog, making the Romans' heavy armor a curse. Their formations collapsed in the mud, and that's when the onslaught began. From the trees, Germanic warriors unleashed a storm of javelins and arrows. They dug hidden trenches to funnel the Romans into kill zones. Ambush after ambush, the legions were cut apart piece by piece. Roman historians later wrote of men so exhausted, they let themselves be slaughtered rather than fight on. Varus, realizing his mistake too late, fell on his sword rather than face capture. The few survivors were sacrificed to Germanic gods or enslaved. It wasn't just a defeat, it was annihilation. 3 entire legions, their treasured eagle standards, and Rome's unshakable aura of invincibility were left rotting in the mud. The shockwaves were immediate. When Augustus heard the news, he reportedly wandered his palace, banging his head against the walls and screaming, "Varus, give me back my legions." The empire's expansion into Germania halted overnight. Rome would never fully recover its appetite for conquering the region, and the Rhine River became its permanent northern border. But the real legacy of Teutoburg was cultural. Without Roman rule, Germanic tribes developed independently, their languages and traditions evolving into what would later become German, Dutch, and English. Arminius, once a footnote in Roman records, was reborn in the 19th century as Hermann the Liberator, a nationalist symbol of German identity. What's chilling is how close we came to a different world. If those legions had survived, Germania might have been Latinized like Gaul. No Germanic tribes means no Anglo-Saxons crossing to Britain, potentially altering the English language itself. No Charlemagne, no Holy Roman Empire. The battle's ripple effects stretch all the way to modern geopolitics, and it all hinged on one brutal truth. Rome's greatest weakness wasn't its enemies, it was assuming everyone wanted to be Roman. Arminius knew that. He'd seen the empire's soft underbelly up close, and in the Teutoburg Forest he tore it wide open. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome, and that was his problem. By 53 before the Common Era, he'd spent decades amassing wealth through ruthless real estate deals and suppressing Spartacus's slave revolt. But in a society where military glory trumped money, Crassus craved something his gold couldn't buy: the kind of prestige his rivals Pompey and Julius Caesar earned on the battlefield. So when the opportunity arose to invade Parthia, a rising empire in the east, he jumped at it, assembling 7 legions and marching into Mesopotamia like a man who'd already written his victory speech. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was a masterclass in how arrogance blinds even the sharpest minds to reality. The Parthians weren't like Rome's usual foes. Their army was built around 2 devastating innovations: horse archers who could loose arrows while retreating at full gallop, the original Parthian shot, and cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry that could trample infantry like straw. Crassus knew none of this. When his scouts warned of strange movements in the distance near Carrhae, he scoffed, insisting the Parthians wouldn't dare face Rome's might head-on. That arrogance cost him everything. The battle began with a psychological trick. The Parthians muffled their drums with cloth, then unleashed a sudden, deafening roar to panic the Roman troops. Next came the arrows, thousands of them, raining down in relentless waves. Roman shields bristled like porcupines as soldiers fell. Crassus's son Publius led a desperate charge to break the barrage, only to be encircled and slaughtered, his head paraded on a spear. By midday, the surviving legionaries were huddled in hollow squares, baking under the sun while Parthian arrows picked them off. When Crassus finally tried to negotiate, the Parthians honored him by pouring molten gold down his throat, a grotesque jab at his infamous greed. The political fallout was immediate. Rome's eastern frontier, once secure, now trembled under Parthian raids. The balance of power between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar shattered, accelerating the civil wars that would doom the Republic. But Carrhae's real legacy was tactical. For the first time, the Mediterranean world saw a heavy infantry empire humbled by mobile cavalry, a lesson the Romans took to heart. Within decades, they'd rebuild their armies with more archers and horsemen, adapting to survive in a world where iron discipline alone wasn't enough. Yet the cruelest twist: Crassus might have won if he'd listened. Armenian allies had begged him to avoid the open desert, offering mountain routes where Parthian horses would struggle. Even during the battle, a moonless night offered a chance to retreat, but Crassus, frantic to salvage his reputation, kept doubling down on disaster. In the end, Carrhae wasn't just a battle, it was a warning. No amount of wealth or pride can bend reality, and when history's tide turns, even the mightiest drown. Rome had suffered defeats before, but nothing like Arosio. The year was 105 before the Common Era, and the Republic was reeling. 2 Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutons, had migrated south not to raid but to settle. When Rome refused, the tribes turned their desperation into a weapon. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a slaughter so catastrophic it nearly broke the empire. The stage was set near Arosio, modern-day Orange in France. Rome sent not 1, but 2 consular armies, 80,000 soldiers, the largest force it had ever assembled. On paper, it should have been a crushing victory, but the generals Quintus Servilius Scipio and Gnaeus Mallius Maximus hated each other more than they feared the enemy. Scipio, a patrician, refused to share command with Maximus, a newcomer from the lower classes. Instead of uniting, they camped separately, their rivalry poisoning morale. Then came the Cimbri and Teutons, a force of warriors hardened by years of migration. They fought unlike anything Rome had seen. Shield walls locked together, their sheer weight shattered Roman lines. Chariots with scythed wheels carved through fleeing troops, and the tribes had one advantage Rome couldn't match: unity. While the legion's leaders bickered, the Germanic chiefs coordinated flawlessly. The result was horrific. Scipio's forces were annihilated first, his arrogance costing his men their lives. Maximus's army, now isolated, collapsed under the onslaught. Survivors later described the Rhine River running red with blood, choked with corpses and abandoned armor. 80,000 Romans dead in a single day, a loss so staggering it dwarfed even Carrhae. But Arosio's true legacy wasn't the defeat. It was the reckoning that followed. Rome, humiliated, faced a bitter truth. Its rigid class system was killing it. The aristocracy's incompetence had nearly doomed the Republic, so they turned to an outsider, Gaius Marius, a gruff, self-made soldier who cared more about winning than tradition. His reforms scrapped the old rules. Now any Roman, rich or poor, could join the legions. Training standardized, weapons improved. The army became professional, loyal not to politicians but to its commanders. Within a decade, Marius's new legions crushed the Cimbri and Teutons at Vercelli, but the lesson lingered. Arosio proved that even the mightiest empire could fall, not to superior force but to its own divisions. And in the ashes of that disaster, Rome found the blueprint for its future conquests. The Republic's darkest hour became the crucible that forged its greatest armies. The Roman Empire had faced setbacks before, but nothing prepared the world for the disgrace at Edessa. It was the year 260, and Emperor Valerian, a 60-year-old ruler more accustomed to political scheming than battlefield command, found himself staring down the rising power of the Sassanid Empire. This wasn't just another border skirmish. The Sassanids, heirs to Persia's ancient glory, had spent decades rebuilding their military into a force Rome couldn't ignore. And Valerian, desperate to prove himself after years of civil wars and plague, marched east with 70,000 men, convinced sheer numbers would guarantee victory. What happened next wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation so profound it shattered Rome's aura of invincibility forever. The Sassanid king, Shapur I, was no ordinary foe. A master of psychological warfare, he'd already carved his triumphs into rock reliefs across Persia, depicting bound Roman emperors groveling at his feet. When Valerian's army reached Edessa in modern-day Turkey, Shapur played his hand perfectly. Roman chroniclers wrote of a phantom retreat, Sassanid cavalry luring Valerian's forces deeper into arid plains where the heat and dwindling supplies took their toll. Then, when the Romans were strung out and exhausted, Shapur sprang the trap. His elite cavalry, the famed Savaran, charged with such force they split Valerian's formations like kindling. But the real horror came after the fighting. Cornered and desperate, Valerian sought peace talks. What he walked into was a betrayal that would echo through history. Shapur didn't want gold or land, he wanted the emperor himself. Roman historians claim Valerian was seized while kneeling in supplication, though Sassanid records paint it as a clever ruse. Either way, the result was the same. A Roman emperor, the very symbol of the civilized world, was now a prisoner of war. The shockwaves were immediate. Coin mints across the empire halted production, as if Rome itself couldn't bear to acknowledge the disgrace. But Shapur wasn't done. What followed wasn't just captivity, it was a calculated degradation. Valerian, once draped in purple, was reportedly used as a human footstool for the Persian king to mount his horse. Later, after his death, his skin was allegedly stuffed with straw and displayed in a Zoroastrian temple, a macabre trophy for generations. Whether entirely true or embellished, the message was clear: Rome could bleed. The political fallout was catastrophic. With Valerian gone, the empire fractured further as regional governors declared themselves emperors. The crisis only deepened when Shapur's forces sacked Antioch, Rome's eastern jewel. Yet Edessa's legacy wasn't just about loss, it forced Rome to adapt. Within decades, emperors like Aurelian would rise, reforming the army and fortifying borders. The empire learned a brutal lesson: arrogance was a luxury it could no longer afford. And in Persia, Shapur's victory became legend, proof that even the mightiest could be brought to their knees. The Tang dynasty stretched its fingers westward like tendrils of silk, its influence brushing against the edges of the known world. By the year 751, China's armies had already carved a path through the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, planting their banners in oasis cities along the Silk Road. But lurking beyond those golden dunes was a rival just as ambitious. the rising Abbasid Caliphate, a powerhouse of the Islamic world hungry for control of the same lucrative trade routes. The collision between these two titans came not in some grand open plain, but in a river valley near Talas in what's now Kazakhstan. And though the battle itself was fierce, its real legacy wasn't decided by swords, it was etched onto something far lighter, paper. At first glance, the forces seemed mismatched. The Tang, led by General Gao Xianji, commanded a seasoned mix of Chinese infantry and allied cavalry from the Turkic Karluk tribes. Across the Talas River, the Abbasid general Ziyad ibn Salih waited with a coalition of Arab warriors and their own Turkic allies. What followed was less a clash of armies than a tug of war for loyalty. For days, the fighting seesawed until the Karluks, sensing a shift in the wind, betrayed the Tang mid-battle. Flipping sides without warning, they slammed into Gao Xianji's flank, turning the tide into a rout. The Tang army shattered, its survivors limping back east. On the surface, it seemed like just another bloody footnote in the endless scrap for territory. But Talas wasn't about land, it was about the future. The Abbasids didn't press their advantage. They didn't chase the Tang into China or dismantle their empire. Instead, something far more subtle and far more revolutionary unfolded. Among the prisoners taken by the Abbasids were artisans skilled in a technology the Islamic world had yet to master: papermaking. Before Talas, the Middle East relied on fragile papyrus or expensive parchment, but the Tang's paper was cheap, durable, and perfect for record-keeping. The Abbasids, no strangers to the power of knowledge, seized the opportunity. Soon, paper mills sprang up in Samarkand, then Baghdad, fueling an explosion of scholarship. The works of Greek philosophers, Persian poets, and Indian mathematicians, once scattered on crumbling scrolls, were now copied onto crisp sheets preserved for posterity. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad's legendary library, became a beacon of learning, all thanks to a technology snatched from the wreckage of a battlefield. Yet the battle's ripple effect stretched even further. For the Tang, Talas was a quiet turning point. The dynasty, already strained by rebellions and overextension, began pulling back from Central Asia, its westward ambitions fading like ink in the rain. The Silk Road's eastern half remained Chinese, but the west slipped into the Islamic sphere, reshaping trade and culture for centuries, and those Karluk tribesmen who switched sides. Their descendants would eventually form the backbone of the Kara Khanate, the first Turkic Muslim state, proof that Talas didn't just change who ruled the map. It changed the map itself. What's astonishing is how little this battle is remembered in the West despite its staggering consequences. No sweeping Hollywood epics, no ballads sung in taverns. But Talas quietly rewrote the rules of history. It wasn't just a fight over a river. It was the moment the ancient world's knowledge, carried on the backs of camels and the edges of swords, found a new home, and in doing so lit the fuse for the Islamic Golden Age. All because two empires clashed, and the real prize wasn't gold or glory, but the humble technology that would carry their stories forward. The Magyars moved like shadows across the land, swift, unpredictable, and utterly ruthless. For decades, these nomadic horsemen from the steppes had terrorized Central Europe, raiding deep into German lands with impunity. Their tactics were pure psychological warfare: strike without warning, vanish before reinforcements arrived, and leave smoldering villages in their wake. By the middle of the 10th century, they'd become the boogeymen of Christendom, a force so feared that monks scribbled frantic prayers in the margins of manuscripts, begging God for deliverance. But in the summer of 955, their reign of terror met an unyielding wall: Otto the Great, the newly crowned king of Germany, and an army determined to fight fire with fire. The stage was set near Augsburg, along the floodplains of the Lech River. Otto, fresh off victories against rebellious dukes, knew this was more than a battle. It was a chance to unite his fractured realm under a common cause. The Magyars, led by their chieftains Bolksu and Lehel, had just pillaged Bavaria and were laden with loot, their usual agility slowed by wagons of plunder. Otto seized the moment. Instead of waiting passively, he marched his forces, a mix of heavy cavalry, Saxon infantry, and Bohemian allies, straight toward the Magyar encampment. What happened next wasn't just a clash of armies, but a collision of two worlds, the old nomadic ways of the steppes versus the rising order of medieval Europe. The Magyars expected chaos. They split their forces, feigning retreat to lure Otto's cavalry into scattered pursuit, a trick that had doomed countless opponents before. But Otto had studied their playbook. He kept his knights disciplined, anchoring them alongside infantry in a tight, unbreakable formation. When the Magyar horsemen wheeled around to unleash their signature arrow storm, they found no gaps to exploit. Otto's countercharge was devastating. His heavy cavalry, clad in chainmail and wielding lances, plowed into the lightly armored raiders like a hammer through glass. The Magyars, trapped between the river and Otto's advancing lines, found themselves in a killing ground of their own making. By nightfall, the field was littered with the fallen. Magyar leaders Bulksu and Lehel were captured and hanged, their surviving warriors fleeing east in disarray. But the real victory wasn't just tactical, it was existential. Lechfeld shattered the myth of Magyar invincibility. Within a generation, their raids ceased entirely, and their descendants settled down, founding the Kingdom of Hungary. For Otto, the triumph was the crowning jewel of his reign. Less than a decade later, he'd be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, his authority unchallenged, yet the battle's deepest legacy was cultural. Lechfeld marked the moment Europe stopped cowering and started pushing back. It cemented the Germanic peoples as the dominant force in Central Europe, shaping borders that would endure for centuries. And ironically, it forced the Magyars to abandon their nomadic roots, transforming them from scourges of Christendom into its guardians. By the time the Crusades began, Hungarian knights would stand alongside Germans against common foes, proof that history's greatest twists often come from the battles we least expect. The Byzantine Empire had weathered storms before, but Manzikert was the earthquake that cracked its foundations. By 1071, the empire had already lost swaths of territory to the Seljuk Turks, nomadic warriors turned empire builders who'd swept out of Central Asia with lightning speed. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes knew the threat was existential. If the Seljuks weren't stopped, they'd cut Byzantium off from its breadbasket in Anatolia, the very heartland that fed and funded the empire. So he assembled the largest army Byzantium had seen in generations, 40,000 men, a mix of Greek heavy infantry, elite Varangian guards, and mercenary cavalry, and marched east to meet the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, near the dusty fortress of Manzikert. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in how pride and poor communication can unravel even the mightiest forces. Romanos, confident in his numerical advantage, split his army before engagement, sending a third of his troops to secure a nearby town. Alp Arslan, a tactician as shrewd as he was ruthless, seized the opportunity. His forces harassed the Byzantines with hit-and-run attacks, their horse archers whittling down Romanos's men without ever committing to a pitched battle. Then, as the sun dipped low on August 26th, the emperor made his fatal mistake. Believing the Seljuks were retreating, he ordered a full advance only to realize too late it was a feint. The Seljuk cavalry wheeled around, surrounding the Byzantines like a noose tightening, but the true disaster wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the ranks. Andronikos Doukas, a rival aristocrat commanding the rear, spread rumors that Romanos was already dead, then deliberately withdrew his troops, abandoning the emperor. The betrayal shattered Byzantine morale. Romanos fought until his horse was killed beneath him, then was captured alive, an unimaginable humiliation for Christendom's most powerful ruler. Alp Arslan, surprisingly merciful, released him after a week, but mercy couldn't undo the damage. Manzikert's immediate fallout was chaos. Romanos returned to Constantinople only to be deposed, blinded, and left to die of his wounds. The Seljuks, smelling blood, poured into Anatolia unchecked. Within decades, the empire lost nearly half its territory, but the battle's real shockwave was spiritual. When Byzantium's desperate pleas for help reached Pope Urban II, he saw a chance to unite Christendom under a new cause, the Crusades. The very idea of holy war, of knights marching east to reclaim lost lands, was born from Manzikert's ashes. Yet the cruelest twist, Manzikert didn't have to be the end. Later historians found Byzantine accounts suggesting the army might have held if not for Doukas' betrayal. The Seljuks were stretched thin. Alp Arslan had no plans to conquer Anatolia outright, but perception shapes reality. The myth of Byzantine invincibility crumbled that day, and with it, the empire's ability to deter enemies. Manzikert wasn't just a lost battle, it was the moment Byzantium's slow bleed became unstoppable. And in the echoes of that collapse, a new world order took shape. One where Western Europe, not Constantinople, would dictate the future of the Mediterranean. The Korean Strait was a graveyard of broken ships and shattered hopes by the autumn of 1597. Japan's invasion of Korea had already dragged on for 5 brutal years, and the Korean Navy, once the pride of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, lay in ruins. Falsely accused of treason by political rivals, he had been tortured, demoted, and stripped of command. His replacement promptly sailed the fleet into a Japanese trap, losing nearly every vessel in a single disastrous battle. When the court, desperate and humiliated, reinstated Yi, they handed him a fleet of exactly 13 ships, most of them makeshift fishing boats retrofitted with cannons. Waiting for him just beyond the Strait of Myeongnyang, a Japanese armada of 133 warships, fresh off their victory and hungry to finish the job. The numbers weren't just lopsided, they were laughable. This wasn't a battle, it was a death sentence, unless, of course, you were Yi Sun-sin. What happened next defied every rule of naval warfare. He knew he couldn't win a head-on fight, so he turned the geography itself into a weapon. Myeongnyang Strait was a death trap, narrow, with whirlpools so fierce locals called them the sea's heartbeat. He anchored his tiny fleet in the choke point, forcing the Japanese to approach in single file, their numerical advantage meaningless in the tight space. Then came the turtle ships, these legendary ironclads, their decks spiked and covered like armored shells, impervious to boarding parties. As the first Japanese ships entered the strait, the tidal current shifted, slowing them to a crawl. Yi's cannons erupted in synchronized volleys, each shot aimed at point-blank range. Ships collided in the chaos, the whirlpools dragged shattered hulls underwater. By midday, the strait was clogged with wreckage, the Japanese vanguard in tatters. But Yi's real genius was psychological. He'd ordered his men to raise every spare sail and pennant, creating the illusion of a larger force. Panic spread through the Japanese ranks. Was this a trap? As their commanders hesitated, Yi pressed the attack, his handful of ships darting like wasps through the chaos. By sunset, 31 Japanese ships had been sunk or captured, their survivors fleeing in disarray. The Koreans, not a single vessel lost. Myeongnyang's aftermath reshaped the war. Japan's navy, crippled and demoralized, never regained the initiative. Yi's victory bought Korea precious time, allowing reinforcements to arrive from Ming China. But the battle's true legacy was its defiance of logic. He didn't just win against impossible odds, he rewrote the playbook. No admiral before or since has pulled off such a lopsided victory. And he did it without a single ship to spare, proving that in war, as in tides, the right strategy can turn even the weakest current into an unstoppable force. The Swedish army under King Charles IX was confident, too confident. By September 27, 1605, they'd marched into Livonia, modern-day Latvia, with 11,000 men, a mix of hardened Swedish infantry and German mercenaries. Facing them, just 3,600 Polish-Lithuanian troops, a quarter of their size. The numbers screamed mismatch. Charles saw an easy victory. What he got instead was a masterclass in how mobility, shock, and sheer audacity could turn the tide of battle. The Polish commander Jan Karol Chodkiewicz wasn't playing by Sweden's rules. His secret weapon, the winged hussars' elite cavalry clad in gleaming half-armor, their backs adorned with wooden frames and eagle feathers that hissed like 1,000 serpents as they charged. These weren't just soldiers, they were psychological warfare on horseback. Chodkiewicz knew the swampy terrain near Kirchholm favored defense, so he lured the Swedes onto higher ground, feigning retreat to stretch their lines thin. Then, as the Swedish advance lost cohesion, he struck. Timing was everything. The hussars didn't just charge, they erupted downhill in a thunderous wedge, lances leveled, their wings creating an unholy din. The impact was catastrophic. Swedish pikemen, trained to hold firm against cavalry, broke instantly, their formations crumpling under the weight of horses and men moving like a single, unstoppable blade. Within minutes, the Swedish center collapsed, their flanks panicking as Lithuanian light cavalry swept in to cut off retreat. Charles himself barely escaped, his army reduced to a shattered remnant. But here's what the history books often miss. Kirchholm wasn't just a triumph of bravery, it was a meticulously planned trap. Chodkiewicz had studied his enemies' arrogance, exploiting their belief in numerical superiority. He'd hidden reserves in nearby woods, timed his feints to perfection, and trusted his hussars to deliver the killing blow. The result, over 9,000 Swedish dead or captured, compared to fewer than 100 Polish-Lithuanian losses, a ratio so ludicrous contemporaries accused Chodkiewicz of sorcery. The battle's aftermath rippled across Europe. Sweden, humiliated, paused its expansion into the Baltic. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, already a regional powerhouse, cemented its reputation for military brilliance. But the true legacy of Kirchholm lies in its dismantling of battlefield dogma. It proved that superior numbers meant nothing without adaptability, and that sometimes the flutter of wings could herald not just victory but the birth of a legend. The Bohemian nobles thought they had time on their side. It was a crisp November morning in 1620, and their hastily assembled army stood atop White Mountain, just outside Prague, confident the approaching imperial forces wouldn't dare attack before winter. The rebels had spent 2 years defying Habsburg rule, electing their own Protestant king, Frederick of the Palatinate, and rallying German allies to their cause. But their biggest mistake wasn't tactical. It was assuming their enemy would play by the rules of gentlemanly warfare. Emperor Ferdinand II had other plans. What unfolded wasn't a battle so much as a massacre. The Habsburg army, led by the ruthless Count Tilly and backed by Spanish veterans, ignored the season's first snowfall to launch a surprise assault. Bohemian defenses were shockingly unprepared, artillery positions unmanned, trenches half dug, and worst of all, their generals bickering over command. When Tilly's armored tercios slammed into their lines, the rebel forces crumbled in under 2 hours. The mountain slopes turned crimson as fleeing troops were cut down by Croatian cavalry, their bodies left to freeze in the mud. But White Mountain's real devastation came after the fighting stopped. Ferdinand, a zealot who saw Protestantism as existential heresy, unleashed a purge that rewrote Central European history. 27 rebel leaders were executed in Prague's Old Town Square, their severed heads displayed on the Charles Bridge for a decade as a warning. Protestant nobility lost their lands, their libraries burned, and their faith was outlawed. Over the next century, Bohemia's culture was systematically erased. German replaced Czech as the official language, and the population forcibly converted to Catholicism. The revolt's spark wasn't just extinguished, its ashes were scattered to the wind. The battle's geopolitical shockwaves were equally profound. Frederick, dubbed the Winter King for his brief reign, fled to Holland in disgrace, igniting a continent-wide conflict as Protestant powers rushed to contain Habsburg dominance. What began as a local rebellion exploded into the 30 Years' War, a catastrophe that would eventually draw in every major European power and claim 8 million lives. Yet few remember White Mountain as the spark. Habsburg propagandists recast it as divine justice, a narrative so potent that even today, Czech schoolchildren learn it as their nation's greatest tragedy. The cruelest irony, the battle didn't have to end this way. Bohemia had been Europe's most tolerant kingdom, a place where Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics coexisted for generations. Ferdinand's vengeance didn't just crush a rebellion. It strangled an alternative vision of Europe, one where faith wasn't dictated by crowns. And in that snowy field outside Prague, the continent's future tilted toward a darker path, one of absolutism, religious wars, and the idea that unity could only be forged through suppression. White Mountain wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment Central Europe lost its chance to be anything other than an empire's brittle puppet. The Ottoman Empire had reached its high water mark by the summer of 1683. For 2 months, the massive army of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, over 150,000 strong, had choked the city of Vienna in a vise of trenches, cannons, and starvation. Inside the crumbling walls, the Habsburg defenders were down to eating rats and boiling leather for broth. The situation was so dire that messengers slipped through enemy lines with one final plea to Christendom: save us or watch Europe's eastern gate swing wide open for Islam. What the Ottomans didn't count on was the thunder of hooves from an unexpected savior, King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, leading the largest cavalry charge in history. This wasn't just a battle, it was a collision of civilizations. The Ottomans had brought everything: enormous siege cannons, miners tunneling beneath Vienna's walls, even lavish tents lined with silk for Mustafa's anticipated victory feast. Meanwhile, Sobieski's relief force was a patchwork alliance of Germans, Austrians, and his infamous winged hussars, their armor gleaming under the September sun. The Polish king knew conventional tactics wouldn't break the siege, so he did something no one expected. He marched his army straight up the near-vertical slopes of the Kollenberg mountain, positioning them like a dagger above the Ottoman camp. Dawn on September 12th revealed the Ottomans' fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed the wooded terrain was impassable for heavy cavalry, leaving their flanks dangerously exposed. Sobieski waited until the Allied infantry had pinned the enemy in brutal, close-quarters combat. Then, as the afternoon heat peaked, he unleashed 18,000 horsemen, 3 waves of them, with the winged hussars at the spearhead. The ground shook as they descended, their lances splintering Janissary ranks, their feathered wings casting eerie shadows. Mustafa's troops, caught between Sobieski's hammer and Vienna's anvil, dissolved into chaos. By nightfall, the Ottomans were in full retreat, abandoning everything from gold-laden tents to sacks of coffee. A novelty Europeans would soon turn into a continent-wide obsession. But Vienna's real legacy wasn't just the battlefield. It marked the moment the Ottoman tide began to ebb for good. Within decades, Habsburg armies would push deep into the Balkans, reclaiming Hungary and Transylvania. The myth of Ottoman invincibility crumbled, and with it, the fear that had gripped Europe for centuries. Sobieski, hailed as the savior of Vienna, penned a triumphant letter to the Pope: "I came, I saw, God conquered." Yet the battle also exposed cracks in Christendom's unity. German princes had hesitated to aid Vienna, and Sobieski's own reward was betrayal when the Habsburgs later snatched territory from Poland. What's often forgotten is how close it all was to disaster. Had Sobieski arrived even a week later, Vienna's defenders would have collapsed. Had the hussars charged too soon, they might have been swallowed by Ottoman artillery. But in that pivotal afternoon, everything aligned, a reminder that history sometimes hinges not on grand strategies, but on the grit of those willing to crest the hill when no one else dares. And so, the last great cavalry charge didn't just save a city, it redrew the map of a continent. The Swedish Empire had spent a century as the terror of Northern Europe, its armies faster, its tactics sharper, its soldiers convinced they were invincible. But arrogance has a way of turning victory into disaster, and nowhere was that clearer than on the sweltering fields of Poltava in June 1709. King Charles XII of Sweden, nicknamed the Lion of the North for his reckless bravery, had spent years humiliating every rival who dared face him. Now, deep in the Ukrainian steppe, he was about to learn the hard way that Russia's Peter the Great wasn't just another opponent. He was the architect of a new kind of war. Charles had already made one critical miscalculation. The previous winter, his army had limped through one of the coldest seasons in memory, starving and frostbitten after a failed march on Moscow. Yet instead of retreating to regroup, he doubled down, besieging the small fortress town of Poltava, hoping to lure Peter into a decisive battle. What he didn't count on was how thoroughly Peter had reformed Russia's military. No longer the disorganized rabble Sweden had crushed at Narva 9 years earlier. This was a professional force, drilled in Western tactics and armed with cutting-edge artillery. And Peter himself wasn't just a ruler who delegated war to generals. He'd trained as an artillery officer, sweating alongside his men in their drills. When the Swedes attacked at dawn on June 27th, everything went wrong at once. Charles, wounded days earlier by a stray bullet, had to be carried into battle on a stretcher, his command blurred by pain and fever. His infantry, weakened by months of privation, charged headlong into Peter's fortified lines, only to find themselves trapped in a killing field. Russian cannons tore gaps in their ranks, while fresh cavalry squadrons outflanked them. The Swedes fought with their trademark fury, but this time brute courage wasn't enough. By midday, their army was shattered, survivors fleeing into the wilderness where Cossack horsemen hunted them down. Charles himself narrowly escaped, fleeing south to Ottoman territory with a handful of guards. Poltava's aftermath reshaped the continent overnight. Sweden's era as a great power was over, its Baltic dominions soon carved up by Russia and its allies. But Peter's victory wasn't just about territory, it was about perception. For the first time, Europe saw Russia not as a backward curiosity, but as a force to be reckoned with. Peter celebrated by minting medals showing himself crowned with laurels, the Latin inscription proclaiming him Father of the Nation. His new capital, St. Petersburg, built on swampland conquered from Sweden, would soon become a window to the West, a symbol of Russia's transformed ambitions. The irony, Charles might have won if he'd listened. His own advisors had begged him to wait for reinforcements or strike at softer targets, but the king, convinced divine favor would carry the day, ignored them. Poltava became a cautionary tale. No amount of past glory can shield you from a foe who learns, adapts, and refuses to play by your rules. And for Russia, it was the moment the world stopped laughing and started listening. The Nawab of Bengal had every reason to feel secure that rainy June morning in 1757. Suraj ad-Daulla's forces outnumbered the British East India Company's troops nearly 10 to 1, 50,000 men against a ragtag force of just 3,000, many of them local sepoys. The Mughal Empire might have been weakening, but here, near the village of Plassey by the Bhagirathi River, tradition said numbers alone should decide the fight. What Suraj didn't know was that his real enemy wasn't the red-coated soldiers across the field. It was the man whispering in his own commander's ears, Robert Clive, a brash company officer who turned betrayal into an art form. Clive's strategy relied less on muskets than on greed. Weeks before the battle, he'd identified Suraj's most disgruntled generals, chief among them Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own uncle. Secret meetings in riverboats, chests of silver smuggled under cover of darkness. Clive promised Mir Jafar the throne itself if he'd hold his troops back during the fighting. Even the Nawab's artillery commander, Rai Durlab, was bought off with pledges of land and titles. By the time the first cannon fired on June 23rd, half of Suraj's army was already a phantom force, their loyalty auctioned to the highest bidder. When the battle began, the farce unfolded exactly as Clive had scripted. Monsoon rains turned the field to mud, rendering Suraj's elephant-drawn cannons nearly useless. The Nawab's French artillery advisors urged a full assault, but Mir Jafar and his conspirators stalled, pretending confusion. For hours, Clive's outgunned troops traded sporadic fire with isolated pockets of Suraj loyalists until the rains returned with a vengeance. As Mughal gunpowder stores turned to soggy waste, Clive ordered a sudden advance. Mir Jafar's men stood aside like spectators. By dusk, Suraj was fleeing on camelback, his empire dissolving behind him. The aftermath was even more audacious than the battle itself. Mir Jafar, installed as puppet Nawab, handed the company staggering concessions, tax collection, rights over Bengal's richest provinces, a personal fortune for Clive, and open looting of the Bengal treasury. Contemporary accounts describe silver-laden barges sinking under their own weight as they floated down river to Calcutta, but Plassey's true cost wasn't measured in rupees. It marked the moment the East India Company stopped being traders and became rulers, a private corporation governing millions, answerable only to distant shareholders. What's often overlooked is how narrowly this hinge of history swung. Clive had gambled everything. Had Suraj loyalists held firm for one more hour, the monsoon downpour might have drowned the British advance instead of enabling it. But in that fragile window, a handful of traitors and a company clerk turned soldier reshaped a subcontinent's destiny. Within 50 years, the company would control more of India than the Mughals ever had, all because one man understood that in the right hands, a bag of coins could be deadlier than any cannon. The forests of upstate New York crackled with tension in the autumn of 1777. For the British, it was supposed to be the knockout punch, a daring plan to split the rebellious American colonies in half by marching General John Burgoyne's army south from Canada, while other forces squeezed New England from the east and west. Instead, it became the moment the revolution clawed its way back from the brink, and at the center of it all stood a man history would later brand a traitor, Benedict Arnold. Burgoyne's campaign had started with swagger. His troops, a mix of British regulars and German mercenaries, advanced with bands playing and wagons laden with fine wines and silverware. But the wilderness had other plans. Supply lines stretched thin. Rebel militias felled trees to block roads. By September, Burgoyne was desperate, gambling everything on breaking through to Albany. What he found waiting near Saratoga was an American army finally starting to act like one, thanks in no small part to Arnold's furious energy. While General Horatio Gates, the nominal American commander, favored cautious defense, Arnold practically vibrated with aggression. At Freeman's Farm on September 19th, he led reckless, unplanned charges that cost the British dearly. Witnesses described him galloping through musket fire, rallying men who had no business holding their ground against disciplined redcoats. Twice, British bayonet charges nearly overran the American lines. Twice, Arnold's improvised counterattacks drove them back. By day's end, the field was littered with casualties, but the Americans had held, and Burgoyne's aura of invincibility was crumbling. Then came the moment that should have cemented Arnold's legacy. On October 7th, as Burgoyne launched a last-ditch assault, Arnold, technically stripped of command after quarreling with Gates, exploded onto the battlefield without orders. Mounted on a stolen horse, he led a headlong charge straight into the British fortifications at Bremen Redoubt. A bullet shattered his leg, but not before his men overran the position, sealing Burgoyne's fate. 10 days later, the British surrendered, their entire northern army gone. Here's what the history books gloss over. Without Arnold, Saratoga might have been a cautious stalemate at best. His relentless attacks unnerved Burgoyne. His instinct for weak points turned skirmishes into victories, and his sheer audacity convinced France to finally back the American cause. That alliance, born from Saratoga's triumph, would win the war. Yet within 2 years, Arnold, bitter over slights real and imagined, would defect to the British. His name became synonymous with betrayal, his earlier heroism erased. The irony is staggering. The man whose battlefield brilliance secured America's independence couldn't stomach the politics that followed. Saratoga stands as a monument to how history bends, not just by the hands we celebrate, but by those we're too ashamed to remember. And perhaps that's the battle's real lesson. Revolutions aren't won by flawless heroes. They're won by flawed, furious men who, for one fleeting moment, set fire to the rules and changed the world. The mud-churned fields of northeastern France seemed an unlikely stage for a revolution's rebirth. By September 1792, the fledgling French Republic was teetering. Prussian and Austrian forces had crossed the border, their veteran armies marching toward Paris with the grim efficiency of men who'd spent lifetimes perfecting war. Their mission: crush the revolution, restore the monarchy, and snuff out the dangerous ideas of liberty before they could spread. Facing them stood a ragtag collection of French volunteers, many still in civilian clothes, their ranks riddled with desertions and dysentery. On paper, it wasn't a battle, it was an execution, but history has a funny way of flipping the script when morale becomes the deadliest weapon of all. The morning of September 20th dawned thick with fog, perfect weather for chaos. The Prussians, led by the Duke of Brunswick, expected the French to break at the first whiff of gunpowder. Their troops were disciplined professionals, heirs to Frederick the Great's legendary military machine. The French, a mix of revolutionary zealots, former royal soldiers still adjusting to their new tricolor flag, and volunteers who'd never fired a musket until that summer. What they lacked in experience, though, they made up for in something far more potent: sheer, defiant belief. As the Prussian ranks advanced through the mist, French artillery commander Francois Kellerman made a gamble that would echo through history. Instead of scattering his guns, he clustered them on a ridge near Valmy's windmill, creating a wall of iron that roared to life with synchronized fury. For hours, the two armies traded cannon fire across the sodden valley, a surreal duel where neither side could see the other clearly through the fog and smoke. The French artillery, drilled tirelessly by Kellerman, fired with startling precision, while Prussian cannonballs plowed harmlessly into the mud. Then came the moment that changed everything. As a lucky French shot tore through a Prussian ammunition wagon, sending debris skyward, something unexpected rippled through the enemy ranks' hesitation. Brunswick, sensing his men's wavering morale, ordered an infantry advance. The French response, a thunderous chorus of "Vive la Nation," erupting from the ridge so loud it drowned out the cannons. The Prussians halted. These weren't the terrified peasants they'd expected. These were men who believed they were fighting for the soul of history itself. By dusk, Brunswick called off the attack. His army, though barely bloodied, withdrew not from defeat, but from the dawning realization that crushing this revolution would cost more than anyone had bargained for. Valmy wasn't won by superior tactics or numbers. It was won by an idea that men who fight for something beyond pay or orders can bend fate itself. Goethe, watching from the Prussian camp, later wrote that he'd witnessed the birth of a new epoch in world history. He was right. Within months, the French army would surge across Europe, exporting revolution at bayonet point. But none of it would have happened without those fog-drenched hours near a nameless windmill, where the world learned an unsettling truth: sometimes belief is the deadliest cannon of all. The Bay of Navarino should have been a quiet anchorage, a sheltered crescent of water where the combined Ottoman and Egyptian fleets could ride out the autumn of 1827 under the watchful guns of coastal fortresses. Instead, it became the stage for one of history's most chaotic naval battles, a 4-hour maelstrom of splintering wood and screaming metal that would mark the end of an era. This wasn't just a fight between empires, it was the last gasp of wooden warships before steam and iron changed warfare forever. The spark was grease. After 6 years of bloody rebellion against Ottoman rule, the European powers Britain, France, and Russia had grown weary of the slaughter. Their solution: a show of force to pressure the Ottomans into accepting Greek autonomy. Admiral Edward Codrington's Allied fleet sailed into Navarino with orders to enforce a ceasefire, not start a war. But diplomacy dies fast when tensions run high. The Ottoman Egyptian commander Ibrahim Pasha had spent months ravaging the Greek mainland, burning villages and deporting civilians. His fleet, nearly 90 ships strong, bristled with cannons and defiance. When Codrington's smaller squadron entered the bay on October 20th, they found their supposed allies arrayed in a defensive horseshoe, guns primed, crews tents. What happened next remains hotly debated. Some claim a nervous Egyptian sailor fired first. Others insist it was a British boat responding to a perceived threat. Regardless, the explosion of musketry from an Egyptian frigate triggered pandemonium. Codrington, trapped in the bay with no room to maneuver, made a brutal calculation: fight or be annihilated. His flagship, the HMS Asia, crashed into the Egyptian line at point-blank range, its broadsides ripping through hulls like parchment. The French ship Breslau unleashed a devastating innovation: explosive shells, not solid shot, sending enemy vessels up in flames. The Ottomans and Egyptians fought with desperate courage, but they were outmatched by the Allies' disciplined gun crews and superior tactics. By nightfall, the bay resembled a floating graveyard. Over 60 Ottoman Egyptian ships were sunk or ablaze, their wreckage choking the water. The Allies lost not a single vessel, yet the real shockwave was political. Navarino wasn't just a victory, it was an unauthorized annihilation. Codrington had exceeded his orders, and European capitals reeled at the scale of destruction. For Greece, the battle was salvation. Within a year, independence was secured. For naval warfare, it was a turning point, proof that even the mightiest wooden fleets were vulnerable to concentrated firepower. And for the Ottomans, it was humiliation made visceral, a wound that would fester as their empire continued its long, slow unraveling. Navarino didn't just decide a war, it whispered the future. The age of sail was ending, and the sea itself would never feel so small again. The redcoats of the British Empire had never faced anything like Isandlwana. By January 1879, confidence brimmed among Lord Chelmsford's forces as they marched into Zululand. This was supposed to be a quick campaign, a demonstration of imperial might against what Victorian officers dismissively called savages with spears. Their rifles, artillery, and disciplined formations had crushed rebellions from India to Africa. The Zulu kingdom, with its 40,000 warriors armed primarily with cowhide shields and short-stabbing spears called ikulwas, didn't stand a chance. Or so they thought. What unfolded on the rocky slopes beneath Isandlwana's distinctive sphinx-like hill wasn't just a battle. It was the moment colonial arrogance met indigenous brilliance head-on. Chelmsford had split his forces, taking half his men on a fruitless search for the Zulu main army, while leaving 1,500 troops, mostly British regulars and colonial volunteers, camped in a sprawling, poorly defended position. They didn't bother to dig trenches or form a defensive logger with wagons. Why bother? The Zulus, they assumed, would never dare attack a fortified British position directly. But the Zulu king Cetshwayo and his commanders had spent years studying their enemy. Unlike European armies that prized static lines and volley fire, the Zulus perfected the horns of the buffalo, a tactic where younger warriors encircled the foe while veteran regiments hammered the center. On January 22nd, 20,000 Zulus emerged from the tall grass like a sudden storm. British officers initially mistook their advance for a herd of distant cattle until the ground began to tremble. What followed was a masterclass in tactical adaptation. The Zulus didn't charge blindly. They used the terrain to mask their numbers until the last moment. When British volleys tore gaps in their ranks, they flowed around the dead-like water, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The Redcoats' tight formations, so effective against other European armies, became death traps as ikulwas stabbed upward between their bayonets. Even the British artillery, hastily firing at point-blank range, couldn't stop the tide. Within hours, the camp was overrun, rifles jammed with dust, ammunition boxes left locked in wagons miles away, and survivors scrambling for their lives. By afternoon, every British soldier lay dead, their bodies stripped of uniforms and weapons. Isandlwana's aftermath sent shockwaves through the empire. Newspapers splashed headlines of massacre, and Queen Victoria demanded answers, but the real lesson wasn't about brutality, it was about blindness. The British had underestimated the Zulus' discipline, their ability to maneuver at scale, and their willingness to absorb horrific casualties to achieve victory. Chelmsford's mistakes dividing his forces, neglecting defenses, assuming technological superiority guaranteed success, became case studies in military hubris. Yet the battle's legacy is bittersweet. Though the Zulus won the day, their kingdom fell within months as Britain poured in reinforcements. Isandlwana became a rallying cry for imperial revenge rather than a wake-up call for restraint. But for one bloody afternoon, the world saw the impossible, an African kingdom fighting on its own terms, shattering the myth of European invincibility. And in that fleeting moment, the spear proved mightier than the rifle. Italy's generals expected cheers, not catastrophic humiliation, when their army marched into Ethiopia in 1896. Fresh off its own unification just decades earlier, Italy craved the prestige of a colonial empire, and Ethiopia, one of Africa's last independent kingdoms, seemed like easy pickings. The plan was textbook European imperialism. Modern rifles, cannons, and a few thousand well-trained troops would steamroll what Rome assumed were disorganized tribal warriors. But Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia wasn't playing by Europe's script. He'd spent years preparing for this moment, stockpiling rifles, studying his enemy's tactics, and uniting Ethiopia's fractious nobles under a single banner for the first time in generations. When Italy's forces, led by General Orst Baratieri, advanced toward the mountains near Adwa, they weren't just facing an army. They were walking into a trap laid by a ruler who'd turned the colonial playbook against its authors. The morning of March 1st dawned with chaos. Baratieri, pressured by politicians back home to deliver a swift victory, had split his 17,000 troops into 3 columns, sending them stumbling through Ethiopia's rugged highlands in the dark. Menelik's scouts, masters of the terrain, tracked every misstep. By sunrise, the Italian units were isolated, exhausted, and utterly lost, while 100,000 Ethiopian warriors, many armed with modern rifles purchased from French and Russian dealers, waited atop the ridges. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter in slow motion. Ethiopian forces under Empress Tetu's command pinned down Italian reinforcements while Ras al-Ula's cavalry cut off retreat routes. The Italians, trained for orderly European warfare, panicked as wave after wave of Ethiopian troops descended, their war cries echoing through the valleys. By midday, Baratieri's army had disintegrated. Nearly 7,000 Italian and Eritrean Askari troops lay dead, including 2 generals. Another 1,500 were captured, paraded through the streets of Addis Ababa in a spectacle of surrender unthinkable to European audiences. Menelik, showing restraint unheard of in colonial wars, treated his prisoners humanely, even releasing many unharmed. But the message was clear: Ethiopia would not be conquered. Adwa's shockwaves reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Italy's government collapsed in disgrace, its dreams of African empire reduced to ashes. For Europe, the battle was a wake-up call, proof that African resistance could outmaneuver colonial arrogance. Ethiopia, alone among African nations, retained its independence, becoming a beacon of hope for anti-colonial movements worldwide. Menelik leveraged his victory into diplomatic gold, securing recognition from Britain, France, and even a chastened Italy. Yet the battle's true genius lay in its preparation. While European powers dismissed Ethiopia as backward, Menelik had spent years modernizing his army, playing rival empires against each other for arms deals and mastering the art of asymmetric warfare. Adwa wasn't luck, it was the culmination of a leader who understood that survival in the age of imperialism required both the spear and the telegraph. And in that remote mountain pass, he rewrote the rules, proving that sometimes the strongest weapon isn't technology or numbers, but the unshakable will of a people fighting for home. The Russian Baltic fleet had spent 8 months at sea, steaming 18,000 nautical miles in a desperate attempt to reinforce their crumbling Far East squadron. By the time Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky's mismatched armada, a mix of obsolete battleships, overloaded coal tenders, and a hospital ship painted suspiciously like a warship, reached the Tsushima Strait in May 1905, the crews were exhausted, demoralized, and utterly unprepared for what awaited them. Japan's Admiral Togo Hayakairo had spent those same months drilling his crews with fanatical precision, perfecting a weapon the Russians hadn't even anticipated, the long-range naval gun. What unfolded over the next 2 days wasn't just a battle, it was the birth of modern naval warfare and the thunderous arrival of an Asian power onto the world stage. Togo's strategy hinged on 2 brutal truths. First, speed kills. His fleet, though smaller, was newer, faster, and equipped with revolutionary Shimo shells packed with high explosives. The Russian ships, burdened by their epic voyage, couldn't match their agility. Second, information wins wars. While Rozhestvensky's fleet lumbered blindly through fog banks, Japanese scout ships shadowed their every move, relaying positions via wireless telegraphy, a technology the Russians barely understood. When the fleets finally clashed near Tsushima Island, Togo executed a maneuver so audacious it's still studied today, crossing the Russian T not once, but twice, unleashing full broadsides at ranges the Russians thought impossible. The results were apocalyptic. Russian shells designed for close-range armor piercing splashed harmlessly short, while Japanese fire rained down with terrifying accuracy. Within minutes, the battleship Oslobia rolled over, the first modern steel warship sunk purely by gunfire. Chaos spread as Russian captains, their signaling systems destroyed, veered into each other's paths. By nightfall, Togo unleashed his torpedo boats like wolves on crippled prey. The next morning, the few remaining Russian ships, their decks littered with dead and their hulls leaking, raised white flags. Of 38 Russian vessels, 21 were sunk, 7 captured, and 6 interned. Only 3 limped to Vladivostok. Tsushima's repercussions shook empires. For Japan, it was seismic proof that an Asian nation could humiliate a European power on the open sea, paving the way for its recognition as a great power at the Treaty of Portsmouth. For Russia, the defeat sparked the 1905 revolution, the first crack in the Tsarist regime's foundation, but the battle's deepest legacy was tactical. Tsushima rendered old naval doctrines obsolete overnight, proving that speed, gunnery accuracy, and technological edge mattered more than sheer tonnage. Within a decade, every major navy would be racing to build faster, longer-range battleships, a race that climaxed at Jutland in World War I. Yet the cruelest irony lay in the Baltic Fleet's original mission. Sent to relieve Port Arthur, they arrived too late. The fortress had fallen months earlier. Their doomed voyage became a metaphor for imperial overreach, a warning that no amount of stubborn pride could compensate for poor planning and outdated thinking. And in Admiral Togo's meticulous preparation, the world saw a new template for warfare. The side that masters innovation doesn't just win battles, it rewrites history. The Russian steamroller was supposed to be unstoppable. That's what everyone believed in the summer of 1914. With 2 massive armies, the First and Second, surging into East Prussia, Tsar Nicholas II's forces aimed to crush Germany between them like a nut in a vise. Speed was critical. If Russia could overrun German territory fast enough, it would force Berlin to divert troops from the Western Front, relieving pressure on France. But there was one problem with this grand strategy. The Russians hadn't counted on 2 men, a pair of German generals named Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, who were about to rewrite the rules of modern warfare in a single, devastating week. The stage was set near the small town of Tannenberg, a name the Germans deliberately chose for its historical symbolism. Centuries earlier, Teutonic knights had fallen there to Slavic forces. Now history would reverse itself. Russia's Second Army, led by the overconfident General Alexander Samsonov, had pushed deep into German territory, its supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Samsonov assumed his counterpart, General Maximilian von Prittwitz, would stand and fight, but Prittwitz panicked, ordering a full retreat, a move that got him instantly sacked. In his place, the German High Command sent Hindenburg and Ludendorff, a duo who understood something their predecessors hadn't: mobility wins wars. What followed was a masterpiece of deception and encirclement. The Germans intercepted Russian radio transmissions sent unencrypted, as if war were still a gentleman's game, and learned every detail of Samsonov's movements. Meanwhile, Ludendorff executed a daring gamble. He pulled units from the French front via Germany's efficient rail network, concentrating them against Samsonov's flanks while letting the Russians advance into a carefully prepared sack. By the time Samsonov realized what was happening, it was too late. German artillery rained down from three sides, cutting off retreat routes and smashing supply trains. The forests and marshes of East Prussia, which should have offered cover, became death traps as German machine guns mowed down entire regiments. The scale of the disaster was unimaginable. Over 92,000 Russian soldiers were captured, nearly the entire Second Army. Samsonov, wandering lost in the woods, shot himself rather than face disgrace. German casualties, less than 20,000, but Tannenberg's true brilliance wasn't in the body count. It was in the way Hindenburg and Ludendorff exploited every Russian weakness, poor communication, arrogance, and a fatal lack of reconnaissance, to turn certain defeat into a textbook victory. This wasn't just a battle, it was the birth of the modern blitzkrieg, proving that speed, coordination, and psychological dominance could annihilate even the largest foe. Yet the battle's darkest irony lay in its aftermath. Though celebrated as heroes, Hindenburg and Ludendorff's success planted the seeds of Germany's eventual downfall. Convinced by their triumph that encirclement tactics were invincible, they'd later push for unrestricted submarine warfare, a decision that drew America into the conflict. Tannenberg wasn't just a victory, it was a warning. In war, even the sweetest triumphs can become poison if you mistake luck for genius. And for Russia, the defeat was the first tremor in an earthquake that would eventually topple the Tsar himself. The summer of 1920 should have been the moment Soviet communism flooded into Europe. Lenin's Red Army had already crushed its white Russian enemies in the Civil War, and now it turned westward, intent on spreading revolution to Germany's factories and beyond. By August, the Bolsheviks had reached the gates of Warsaw, their commander Mikhail Tukhachevsky boasting that Poland's capital would fall within days. The world held its breath. A Soviet victory here wouldn't just mean the end of Polish independence. It would open the floodgates for communism to sweep across a post-war Europe still fragile from the devastation of World War I. But what no one anticipated was the desperate gamble of a former piano composer turned Polish general, and the tactical masterstroke that would come to be known as the miracle on the Vistula. Poland's commander-in-chief, Józef Pilsudski, faced a nightmare scenario. His forces were outnumbered nearly 3-1, with Soviet troops advancing on three fronts. Foreign diplomats had already fled Warsaw, and Lenin's propagandists were printing pamphlets in Polish, ready to distribute the moment the city fell. Yet Pilsudski spotted a fatal flaw in Tukhachevsky's strategy. The Soviet advance had stretched its supply lines to the breaking point, and the Red Army's northern wing had outpaced its southern forces, leaving a gaping hole in their formation. Most commanders would have fortified the city for a last stand. Pilsudski decided to attack. The plan was audacious beyond belief. While Polish forces staged a desperate defense along the Vistula River, buying time with blood, Pilsudski secretly assembled a strike force south of Warsaw. Then, on August 16th, he launched his counterblow, not at the Soviet vanguard but at the exposed flank. Polish cavalry, often romanticized as lancers charging tanks, actually played a limited role. The real work was done by infantry and artillery attacking under radio intercepts that had cracked Soviet codes. The effect was catastrophic for Tukhachevsky. His northern armies, cut off from supply and communications, collapsed into panic. Entire divisions disintegrated, their men fleeing eastward in disarray. Within a week, the Red Army was in full retreat, leaving behind 40,000 prisoners and enough abandoned equipment to rearm the Polish army twice over. But Warsaw's true miracle wasn't just the victory itself, it was the ripple effects that reshaped Europe. The battle halted Lenin's dream of immediate world revolution, forcing the Soviets to focus inward and eventually adopt the socialism in one country policy. Poland, against all odds, secured its independence for another 19 years, becoming a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and the battle's lessons echoed far beyond its time. Pilsudski's use of maneuver warfare, radio intelligence, and psychological operations foreshadowed the blitzkrieg tactics of World War II. Even the Soviets learned, with a young officer named Georgy Zhukov, later the architect of Stalin's World War II victories, studying the defeat to avoid repeating Tukhachevsky's mistakes. What's often forgotten is how close Europe came to disaster. Had Warsaw fallen, Germany's fragile Weimar Republic, already rocked by communist uprisings, might have succumbed next. France, Britain, the entire continent could have faced a red tide with no unified resistance. That it didn't hinges on a battle most history books gloss over, fought by a nation that had only reappeared on the map 2 years earlier. The miracle on the Vistula wasn't just a triumph of arms, it was proof that in history's darkest hours, sometimes courage and cunning can rewrite the script everyone thought was already finished. Tensions had been simmering for years along the disputed border between Mongolia and Manchuria, a remote stretch of windswept steppe where Soviet and Japanese forces played a dangerous game of territorial chicken. But in the summer of 1939, that game turned deadly. What began as a skirmish over grazing rights escalated into a full-scale clash of empires and an audition for one of history's greatest generals. Georgy Zhukov, then a little-known Soviet commander, arrived at Kholkhin Gol with orders to end the fighting. He left having rewritten the playbook for modern warfare, delivering a defeat so crushing it would echo through every decision Japan made in World War II. The Japanese Sixth Army, confident in their Bushido spirit and years of victories in China, underestimated the steppe's challenges. Their tanks, designed for Manchuria's mud, floundered in the loose sand. Supply lines stretched thin across the arid plains. Worst of all, they dismissed Zhukov as just another Soviet bureaucrat in uniform. They couldn't have been more wrong. Zhukov had spent months studying the terrain, amassing a staggering logistical network: 55,000 tons of ammunition, 17,000 fuel trucks, even prefabricated bridges to cross the Kholkhin River. While Japanese scouts relied on binoculars, Zhukov launched reconnaissance flights daily, building a precise 3D map of every hill and gully. When the battle erupted in late August, Zhukov unleashed a symphony of coordinated violence unlike anything Japan had faced. He feigned weakness along the center, luring Japanese troops into a bulge, then hammered their flanks with a brutal pincer movement. 300 Soviet tanks, many fresh from factories Stalin had prioritized over food production, rolled forward in waves, supported by massed artillery firing pinpoint barrages from concealed positions. Japanese soldiers, trained for bayonet charges and close-quarters combat, found themselves outranged, outgunned, and utterly outmaneuvered. By the time the dust settled, over 60,000 Japanese lay dead or wounded, their elite 23rd Division annihilated. Soviet losses, a fraction of that number. The shockwaves rippled far beyond Mongolia. In Tokyo, the defeat forced a seismic shift in strategy. The Imperial Army, humiliated, abandoned its ambitions to push north into Soviet Siberia, instead turning its gaze southward toward Pearl Harbor and the oil-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. Stalin, meanwhile, gained something even more valuable than land: certainty that when Hitler eventually turned east, he had a commander who could stop him. Zhukov's tactics at Kholkhin Gol, swift encirclements, combined arms, and relentless logistics, would become the blueprint for his defense of Moscow and the eventual destruction of Nazi Germany. Yet the battle's greatest lesson was psychological. Zhukov proved that wars aren't won by spirit alone, but by the cold calculus of preparation and adaptability. While Japan clung to samurai romanticism, the Soviets embraced the mechanized, industrialized reality of 20th century combat. And in that remote corner of the steppe, the course of a world war was quietly decided, not by politicians or treaties, but by a general who understood that victory belongs to those who master the art of war's relentless evolution. The Italian winter of 1944 was a nightmare of mud, blood, and stone. For months, the Allied advance northward had been pinned down by the Gustav Line, a brutal network of German defenses stretching coast to coast across Italy's narrow waste. And at its heart, looming over the Liri Valley like a medieval sentinel, stood the ancient Abbey of Monte Cassino. Built in the 6th century, this mountaintop monastery had survived earthquakes and invasions for over 1,000 years. Now it was about to become the centerpiece of one of World War II's most controversial battles, a grinding, 4-month slaughter where bravery and blunders collided in equal measure. The Germans under Field Marshal Kesselring had turned the surrounding mountains into a fortress. Machine gun nests hid in the rubble of bombed-out villages. Artillery positions were dug into reverse slopes invisible to Allied spotters, and the abbey itself, Allied intelligence was convinced the Germans were using it as an observation post, directing lethal fire onto every attempted advance below. The truth was murkier. German commanders, wary of provoking outrage, had initially kept troops out of the abbey. But perception became reality when, on February 15, waves of American B-17 bombers reduced the historic site to smoldering ruins. The bombing backfired catastrophically. Instead of clearing the way, the rubble created perfect defensive cover for German paratroopers who now swarmed into the ruins, fighting with fanatical determination. What followed was a meat grinder of battles fought in impossible conditions. New Zealand troops attacking through the valley found themselves mired in flooded fields, their tanks bogged down while German snipers picked them off from the heights. Indian Gurkhas scaled cliffs at night with kukri knives, only to be pinned down by mortar fire at dawn. Polish soldiers, many of whom had already lost their homeland to the Nazis, launched bloody frontal assaults up the abbey slopes, their casualties so high that medics stopped counting. One British officer described the fighting as not war but a duel with the devil in a bottomless pit. Yet the battle's real tragedy wasn't just its brutality, it was the stubborn misjudgments that prolonged it. Allied commanders, convinced sheer force would break German morale, repeatedly underestimated Kesselring's defensive genius. It wasn't until mid-May that a breakthrough finally came, not from head-on attacks but from a daring nighttime infiltration by French colonial troops through the supposedly impassable Oronsai Mountains. Their success outflanked the Gustav Line, forcing the Germans to retreat. The Poles, in a final act of bitter symbolism, raised their flag over the abbey ruins on May 18, but the victory came at a horrific cost. Over 50,000 Allied casualties, countless civilians dead in the crossfire, and a medieval treasure trove of art and manuscripts lost to the bombs. Monte Cassino's legacy is a paradox. Tactically, it proved that even the most sophisticated defenses could be cracked with enough persistence and sacrifice. Strategically, it tied down German forces that might otherwise have reinforced Normandy ahead of D-Day. But morally, it remains a cautionary tale about the fog of war. The Abbey bombing, based on flawed intelligence, became a propaganda gift to the Nazis. the relentless frontal assaults revealed how easily pride can override better judgment. And in the end, the battle asked a question we still wrestle with today: when the cost of victory stains the very cause you fight for, who really wins? The answer, like those scarred mountain slopes, offers no easy footing. The jungles of northeast India had never seen anything like it, an entire army starving to death in the green hell they'd sworn to conquer. By the spring of 1944, Japan's 15th Army was supposed to be celebrating its triumph, having swept through British defenses to plant the rising sun flag on Indian soil. Instead, 30,000 emaciated soldiers clung to life in the mud around Imphal and Kohima, their rifles rusted, their boots disintegrating, their stomachs gnawed hollow by hunger. This wasn't just a battle, it was the collapse of an empire's most audacious gamble, a disaster so complete it would rewrite the rules of warfare in the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The Japanese plan had been breathtaking in its ambition. Lieutenant General Renier Mutaguchi, flush with victories across Southeast Asia, envisioned a lightning strike through Burma's mountains to capture the British supply bases at Imphal and Kohima. Cut off these lifelines, he argued, and all of India would crumble like rotten fruit. His superiors in Tokyo, desperate to divert Allied resources from the Pacific, gave the green light. But Mutaguchi ignored three fatal flaws: the monsoon rains that turned trails into quagmires, the near-total lack of motorized transport, and the grim reality that his men would have to carry every bullet and rice ball on their backs across 600 miles of roadless jungle. What followed was a nightmare of hubris meeting ingenuity. The British 14th Army, led by the unassuming but brilliant General William Slim, had spent months preparing for this moment. While Mutaguchi's troops slogged forward on bleeding feet, Slim's forces orchestrated something unprecedented: a fully airborne supply network. Dakota aircraft shuttled endless tons of food, ammunition, and even mules, pack animals being far more reliable than trucks in monsoon-slicked hills to besieged garrisons. When Japanese forces reached Kohima in April, they found not panicked defenders, but a cobbled-together force of British, Indian, and Nepalese Gurkha troops dug into ridges with a wall of artillery and airstrikes at their backs. The siege of Kohima's tennis court became emblematic of the battle's ferocity. For 2 weeks, Japanese and British soldiers fought across a stretch of ground no larger than a city block, so close they could hear each other's whispers. One British officer described the stench of unburied corpses mingling with the sweet rot of jungle orchids. Yet even as the Japanese threw human wave attacks at the defenders, their own supply lines withered. Mutaguchi, refusing to acknowledge failure, ordered attacks to continue even as his men resorted to eating grass and leather straps. By June, the tide had irreversibly turned. Slim's counterattack, bolstered by fresh divisions and relentless air support, sent the Japanese reeling back into Burma. The retreat became a death march of the 85,000 Japanese soldiers who began the campaign. 53,000 never returned. Starvation, dysentery, and malaria claimed more lives than British bullets. Mutaguchi, recalled in disgrace, spent the rest of the war in a psychiatric hospital, his mind broken by the scale of his failure. Imphal Kohima's legacy was profound. It marked the first time in history an Asian invading army had been decisively defeated on the doorstep of India, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility. But more importantly, it redefined modern warfare's most overlooked element: logistics. Slim didn't win with superior tactics or bravery alone. He won because his army could eat, move, and communicate while his enemy could not. In an age of atomic bombs and blitzkrieg, the battle proved that the real measure of an army isn't just its firepower, but its ability to keep its soldiers fed, supplied, and one step ahead of disaster. And in the steamy jungles of India, that lesson was written in blood and hunger. The French commanders thought they'd chosen the perfect stronghold, a remote valley in northwest Vietnam, surrounded by mountains and accessible only by air. Dien Bien Phu was supposed to be an impregnable fortress, a trap to lure the Viet Minh guerrillas into a conventional battle where France's superior firepower would crush them. But General Vo Nguyen Giap, the self-taught mastermind of Vietnam's independence forces, had spent years studying his enemy's weaknesses. When the first French paratroopers floated down into the valley in November 1953, they didn't realize they weren't setting a trap, they were walking into one. Giap's first move defied all military logic. Instead of avoiding the French artillery, he dismantled his own heavy guns and had thousands of porters haul them piece by piece up the surrounding mountains. For months, under cover of darkness and monsoon rains, Viet Minh laborers hacked trails through the jungle, camouflaging gun emplacements with woven bamboo. French reconnaissance planes spotted nothing, just endless green canopy. Meanwhile, Giap's forces dug over 60 miles of trenches, inching closer to the French positions like a noose tightening. By March 1354, when the first shells rained down on the French airstrip, the Viet Minh had over 200 artillery pieces hidden in the hills, their muzzles perfectly zeroed in on every bunker and supply depot below. The French garrison, led by Colonel Christian de Castries, quickly realized their fatal miscalculation. Their airstrip, the lifeline for supplies and reinforcements, was now a kill zone. Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns shredding any plane attempting to land. Within days, the wounded lay piled in open trenches, their bandages crusted with mud and flies. French tanks bogged down in the waterlogged rice paddies became stationary coffin for their crews. Yet the most terrifying weapon wasn't Giap's artillery, it was his trenches. Night after night, Viet Minh sappers tunneled forward, detonating mines beneath French strongpoints. One by one, the outposts fell with grim nicknames like Iliane and Dominique, becoming slaughterhouses where hand-to-hand combat raged in waist-deep water. By May, the valley had become a charnel house. French defenders, out of ammunition, resorted to throwing empty cognac bottles at attackers. Giap, sensing victory, launched human wave assaults, knowing his casualties would be horrific but counting on French morale to break first. On May 7th, after 56 days of siege, the last radio transmission from French headquarters crackled through static. The enemy is everywhere. The situation is very grave. The combat is confused and goes on all about. I feel the end approaching. Hours later, Viet Minh troops overran the command bunker, hauling down the French tricolor. Over 10,000 French troops marched into captivity. Fewer than half would survive the brutal march to prisoner camps. Dien Bien Phu's shockwaves shattered empires. In Geneva, France signed away its Indochina colonies within months, but the battle's true legacy was strategic. Giap had proven that a guerrilla army could defeat a colonial power not by matching its strength, but by rewriting the rules of engagement. The siege became a blueprint for insurgent warfare, patient logistics, psychological endurance, and the willingness to suffer staggering losses for ultimate victory. And for the watching world, especially the United States, it offered a chilling preview of the brutal calculus that would define Vietnam for decades to come. In wars of national liberation, firepower alone could never compensate for a cause that refused to die. The cold was the real enemy, a merciless, biting freeze that turned rifles into icy metal sticks and blood into slush in the veins. November 1950 in Korea's Chosin Reservoir wasn't just winter, it was a killing force all its own. The United Nations forces, led by American Marines, had pushed deep into North Korea, confident they'd reunite the peninsula by Christmas. What they didn't know was that 300,000 Chinese soldiers, silent and unseen, had crossed the frozen Yalu River, waiting to spring history's largest ambush. When the attack came, it wasn't with warning shots or battle cries, just the sudden, thunderous blare of bugles in the night, cutting through temperatures that plunged to -35 degrees. Outnumbered 10-1, the 1st Marine Division found themselves surrounded in the mountainous terrain, their supply lines severed. Chinese human wave attacks came relentlessly, whole regiments charging through machine gun fire until the bodies piled high enough to become cover for the next wave. But here's where the legend began. Instead of collapsing, the Marines turned their retreat into one of the most savage fighting withdrawals in military history. They called it advancing in a different direction because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. Truck convoys froze solid, men pried their wounded from the ice with bare hands. At the Funchalen Pass, engineers performed a miracle airlifting an entire bridge in sections to span a blown-out gap, all while under mortar fire. What defied logic was the casualty count. The Chinese, despite their overwhelming numbers, suffered astronomical losses. Some estimates suggest over 60,000 dead, many frozen solid where they fell. The Marines, they brought out nearly all their wounded and dead, along with thousands of refugees, fighting their way to the sea over 80 punishing miles. Every step was a battle, hilltops taken and abandoned, airstrikes called in so close the explosions singed frostbitten faces. When they finally reached the port of Hungnam, their uniforms were stiff with blood and ice, but their rifles were clean and ready. The Chosin Reservoir became more than a battle. It was a testament to the raw will of men pushed beyond human limits. Marines who survived would later joke they earned the nickname the Frozen Chosin, but the joke hid something deeper. In the face of impossible odds, they'd proven that leadership, training, and sheer grit could defy even the coldest arithmetic of war. And for the Chinese, the victory they'd paid for in blood carried a hidden cost. The world now knew their armies could bleed too. The Korean War's tide would turn again, but no one who fought at Chosin ever forgot the price of survival or the valor it took to claw their way out of that frozen hell. The helicopters came in low and fast, their rotors whipping the tall elephant grass into a frenzy as the first American boots touched Vietnamese soil. November 14, 1965, the Ia Drang Valley, a place few could find on a map, was about to become the crucible where the Vietnam War's brutal new rules were forged. This wasn't just a battle, it was a collision of philosophies. On one side, the US Army's air cavalry, confident that technology and firepower could dominate any battlefield. On the other, North Vietnam's seasoned guerrillas, masters of terrain who believed no amount of helicopters could outlast human will. By the time the smoke cleared, both sides would carry lessons from Ia Drang, ones that would haunt them for the next decade. The Americans had a revolutionary tool, the Huey. These helicopters allowed troops to bypass jungles and land directly in enemy territory, a tactic called air mobility. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's battalion was dropped into landing zone X-ray, a clearing surrounded by dense forest, expecting to flush out a small Viet Cong force. Instead, they stumbled into 3 regiments of the North Vietnamese Army, nearly 2,000 soldiers who'd spent years fighting French colonialism. Within hours, the clearing became a killing ground. The NVA swarmed like ants, using tunnels and termite mounds for cover, closing gaps so tight that American artillery had to risk hitting their own men to stop the onslaught. Moore's leadership held the line. His order, "We will leave no man behind, dead or alive," became legendary as wounded soldiers fought alongside the living, their rifles propped on the bodies of fallen comrades. At one point, a desperate sergeant called in airstrikes so close that the explosions stripped bark from trees overhead. Meanwhile, the NVA showcased their gruesome ingenuity, taping flashlights to bamboo sticks to simulate troop movements and lure fire into empty jungle. The battle raged for 3 days, waves of attacks and counterattacks turning the red dirt black with gunpowder. But the real shock came afterward. Though the Americans claimed victory at X-Ray, a sister battalion marching to their relief was ambushed in nearby landing zone Albany. This time, there was no clear field of fire, just close-quarter slaughter in tall grass where visibility dropped to 3 feet. The NVA's tactics were brutally simple: isolate small groups, kill radio operators first, then pick off the rest. By nightfall, over 150 Americans lay dead in a single afternoon. some found with their bayonets still locked in enemies' ribs. Drang's legacy was a paradox. The US saw proof that air mobility could work, doubling down on helicopter assaults for years to come. The North Vietnamese drew a different lesson. Their commander famously said, "If you kill one American, 10 more will come. But if you kill 10, they'll eventually leave." Both were right. The battle birthed the grinding strategy of attrition. The US counting bodies had no counting patience. And in the valley's whispers, you could already hear the war's future. A conflict where winning firefights didn't mean winning the war, and where courage alone couldn't outlast a people fighting for their homeland. Drang wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment both sides realized exactly how long and dark the tunnel ahead would be. The streets of Mogadishu pulsed with tension on October 3, 1993, a city so lawless even the rats moved in armed packs. What began as a routine snatch-and-grab mission for US Delta Force and Army Rangers capturing 2 lieutenants of Somali warlord Mohammed Farah aided, morphed into an 18-hour nightmare that would redefine modern urban combat. The planners called it Operation Gothic Serpent. The soldiers who lived through it would call it something simpler: hell. The first mistake was underestimating the terrain. Intelligence maps showed wide boulevards and predictable alleyways, but Mogadishu was a labyrinth of crumbling stone and corrugated metal. Every rooftop a potential sniper nest, every window a muzzle flash waiting to happen. When 2 Black Hawk helicopters, Super 6-1 and Super 6-4, crashed within blocks of each other, the mission's clockwork precision unraveled. Somali militiamen, tipped off by the thunder of rotors, swarmed like hornets from a kicked nest. These weren't disorganized rabble. They moved with chilling coordination, using the city's geometry against the Americans. Kids as young as 10 darted between gunfights to reload AK-47s for grown fighters. Women hurled grenades from doorways, vanishing before return fire could find them. The urban battlefield had become a living, breathing predator. Communication breakdowns magnified the chaos. Ranger units racing to secure the first crash site found themselves pinned down in intersections, their Humvees chewed apart by rocket-propelled grenades. Delta snipers Randy Shewart and Gary Gordon, defying orders to stay put, inserted themselves at the second crash site, only to be overrun by hundreds of militiamen, their last stand immortalized by spent brass piling up around their boots. Meanwhile, a relief convoy took wrong turns into ambush after ambush, their maps useless in a city where every corner looked identical under fire. What turned disaster into legend was the resilience of the men trapped in the kill zone. With no armored support, low on ammo, and surrounded by thousands of hostiles, the Rangers adopted a brutal simplicity: stack the dead for cover, scavenge weapons from the fallen, and hold until dawn. Medic Jeff Strucker commandeered a smoking Humvee to make multiple runs through streets slick with blood, hauling out wounded while bullets spiderwebbed the windshield. Overhead, Little Bird helicopters skimmed rooftops, door gunners firing downward so steeply their shell casings rained onto their own rotor blades. The aftermath exposed hard truths. 18 Americans dead, 73 wounded, and 2 Black Hawks lost, but Somali casualties, estimated in the hundreds, revealed the ugly math of urban warfare. For every militiaman shot, 10 seemed to take his place. The battle's real lesson wasn't about courage, it was about preparation. No amount of night vision or body armor could compensate for flawed intelligence, cultural ignorance, and a failure to anticipate how a city itself could become a weapon. Mogadishu forced militaries worldwide to rethink close-quarters combat, paving the way for today's drone reconnaissance and rapid extraction protocols. Yet the deepest wound was psychological. The images of stripped American corpses dragged through cheering crowds didn't just end a mission, they reshaped US foreign policy for a generation. The ghosts of those 18 hours still whisper a warning. In asymmetric war, victory isn't measured in body counts but in whose will crumples first. And sometimes the strongest steel bends in the unlikeliest of streets. The Russian tanks rolled into Grozny on New Year's Eve 1994 to the sound of clinking champagne glasses in Moscow, where generals had promised a quick victory parade by Christmas. Instead, they were walking into the deadliest urban meat grinder since Stalingrad. Chechnya's capital wasn't just a city, it was a death trap meticulously prepared by separatist fighters who'd spent years studying Soviet military tactics. And what followed wasn't a battle, it was a masterclass in how arrogance and outdated strategies can turn modern armies into sitting ducks. Grozny's streets had been transformed into a labyrinth of kill zones. Chechen commander Aslan Maskadov, a former Soviet artillery officer, knew exactly how Russian forces would move, columns of tanks advancing along wide boulevards, relying on brute firepower to crush resistance. So he flipped the script. Buildings along main thoroughfares were rigged with explosives, their upper floors turned into sniper nests with clear lines of fire downward onto tank hatches, their weakest point. The Russians, trained for open field warfare, had no answer for enemies who struck from sewers, rooftops, and even disguised bunkers beneath piles of rubble. The first Russian armored column entered the city like a parade, expecting civilians to wave white flags. Within hours, it was a smoking graveyard. Chechen fighters let the tanks roll deep into the city, then detonated pre-placed charges, trapping the vehicles in kill boxes. Rocket-propelled grenades fired from alleys at point-blank range punched through side armor like paper. Russian infantry, trained to fight alongside tanks, were cut down as they dismounted many before their boots even touched pavement. One survivor described the scene as a zoo where the animals had gotten loose and were hunting the zookeepers. Communication breakdowns made the slaughter worse. Russian units using unencrypted radios might as well have been broadcasting their positions live. Chechen eavesdroppers redirected artillery strikes back onto Russian reinforcements. Meanwhile, Russian commanders, desperate to save face, kept pouring troops into the same deadly corridors, convinced sheer numbers would break the stalemate. They didn't just pile corpses higher. By the time the Russians clawed their way to the city center in February, they'd lost over 1,500 soldiers and 200 armored vehicles. For what? A bombed-out ghost town where Chechen snipers still picked off stragglers from the skeletal remains of apartment blocks. But Grozny's real tragedy lay in what it revealed. This wasn't just a military failure, it was the collapse of an entire doctrine. The Russian army, still organized for World War II-style confrontations, had no concept of asymmetric urban warfare. Their artillery and airstrikes, intended to soften defenses, mostly killed civilians, turning local support into seething hatred. Chechen fighters, by contrast, moved like ghosts supplied by tunnels, treating wounds in basement hospitals and vanishing before Russian spotters could call in coordinates. The battle's aftermath haunted Russia for decades. Though they technically won by occupying Grozny's ruins, the moral and strategic cost was staggering. The Chechen War became a festering wound, reigniting in 1999 and birthing a new generation of insurgents. More damningly, Grozny exposed a truth modern militaries still grapple with. In dense urban terrain, technology and firepower mean nothing without adaptability. The Russians had all the hardware, but the Chechens had the patience, the cunning, and the absolute refusal to play by the rules their enemy had written. And in the end, that proved far deadlier than any tank. History isn't just written by the victors, it's edited by time, distorted by perspective, and too often reduced to a handful of marquee moments while the rest gathered dust. These forgotten battles weren't mere footnotes. They were tectonic shifts disguised as clashes of steel and flesh. Think about it. A single afternoon in the Teutoburg Forest rerouted the destiny of Europe's languages and borders. The ripple effect of a paper-making technique stolen from Chinese prisoners at Tollers fueled the intellectual fires of the Islamic Golden Age. And in the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir, the survival of an outnumbered, surrounded force rewrote the playbook on what determination could defy. Each of these battles proves that history's most pivotal turning points don't always come with fanfare. They happen in muddy fields, dense jungles, or silent stretches of ocean, where the outcomes aren't just about who held the ground, but whose ideas outlived the carnage. The Byzantine Empire never recovered from Manzikert's betrayal, yet that same disaster birthed the Crusades. The Zulus' triumph at Isandlwana shattered colonial myths of invincibility, even if their kingdom fell soon after. And the whispers of Dien Bien Phu's siege still echo in every guerrilla movement that's ever stared down a superpower and refused to blink. So here's the unsettling question: if battles this consequential could fade from mainstream memory, what else are we missing? How many other moments where cultures collided, technologies transferred, or empires fractured have been squeezed out of our textbooks to make room for the usual parade of dates and dynasties? The past isn't a monolith, it's a mosaic of struggles, accidents, and sheer stubbornness that rarely fits into tidy narratives. That's why these stories matter. They're reminders that the world we live in, the languages we speak, the borders we cross, even the coffee we drink was forged in places like Valmy's fog or Mogadishu's alleys. And if there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this: history isn't just about remembering the battles we're told to remember, it's about digging for the ones they left out. Now, over to you. Which of these hidden hinges of history shocked you the most? Was it the molten gold of Carrhae, the whispered betrayals at Plassey, or the wings of the hussars at Vienna? Drop your pick in the comments, and who knows, the conversation might just uncover another story worth resurrecting.